When my son called to say his studio was finally ready, I told him I would bring the good bourbon and we would celebrate properly. He went quiet on the line. Too quiet. Then my daughter-in-law's voice came through in the background, clear as glass breaking. "Tell him, Ethan. Just tell him." My son cleared his throat. "Dad, the opening was actually last month. We didn't want to stress you out." The $85,000 I had wired to their account 6 weeks earlier had already been spent on a party I was never invited to attend. 3 weeks after that phone call, they showed up at my door, asking for more. I looked at both of them standing on my porch and said, "Get off my property." But I'm getting ahead of myself. I had spent 38 years building web custom millwork from a one-car garage in Portland into an operation with 16 employees and a reputation that reached from here to Seattle. We made kitchen cabinetry, built-ins, custom furniture for restaurants and hotels, real work, sawdust and router bits, and the smell of finishing oil. When my wife, Carol, passed 9 years ago from a cardiac event that gave no warning, I threw myself back into that work because it was the only thing that made sense. Wood you could hold, problems you could solve with the right tool, a finished piece you could look at and know exactly what it had cost you. My son was 31 years old, tall like his mother, with her same way of filling a room just by walking into it. He had studied interior design at Oregon State, graduated with honors, spent 3 years working for a firm downtown before deciding he wanted his own studio. I understood that. I had wanted my own shop at 26, and I made it happen with a small business loan and 18-hour days. When my son came to me last spring with a business plan printed and bound, sitting across from me at my kitchen table with his eyes bright and his hands folded, I felt something I had not felt in years. Pride that moved through me like warmth from a wood stove. His wife sat beside him. She had been in the picture for 2 years by then. Jade, 31 herself, with a background in marketing and a voice that carried authority the way some people carry cologne, pervasive and difficult to ignore. She had done most of the talking at that kitchen table. The studio would be called Form and Grain, a nod to my trade, she said, and I appreciated the gesture. They needed $85,000 for a lease on a space in the Pearl District, build-out costs, equipment, initial operating expenses. She had a projected revenue model. She had a brand deck. She said the name twice, Form and Grain, like she was already proud of it. I told my son I believed in him. That was the truth. I wrote the check the following week, an electronic transfer from my business savings to his personal account, because they did not yet have a business account set up. I told myself that was a minor detail. It was not. The months that followed were busy for me. A large restaurant contract in the Pearl District itself kept my shop running nights and weekends. I texted my son occasionally, asked how things were coming. He always responded quickly, "Great, Dad." Really coming together. I did not push for details because I did not want to hover. He was a grown man. This was his dream to build. Then came that phone call. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time after he hung up. My workshop dog, a 12-year-old lab named Copper, put his head in my lap. I scratched behind his ears without seeing him. The opening was last month. Not an apology in those words. Not a single word of apology. Just a statement, like he was correcting a calendar entry. I did not call back. I went to my shop, turned on the dust collector, stood at my bench, and did not pick up a single tool for 45 minutes. I just stood there. When you build things with your hands, you develop a relationship with patience. You learn to hold still when you are frustrated, because frustration ruins joinery. I held still. Then I went home and pulled out every document I had saved for the past 3 years that related to my son. The folder took 20 minutes to compile. It was not as thick as I expected. I had given money in a fairly direct and trusting way, which is to say I had not kept receipts the way a suspicious person would. But I had bank statements. I had transfer confirmations. I had a copy of the business plan he had presented to me, neatly printed, with the projected expense breakdown on page 4. I made myself coffee and started reading. Page 4 of the business plan showed $85,000 allocated as follows. Lease, deposit, and first 3 months, $22,000. Build out and renovation, $30,000. Equipment and software, $14,000. Marketing and branding, $8,000. Operating reserve, $11,000. I opened my laptop and navigated to my bank's portal, pulled up the transfer record. $85,000. Confirmed. Received. Then I searched for the studio online. Form and Grain Interior Studio, Pearl District, Portland. The Instagram page had launched 8 weeks ago. The opening event photos were there. Maybe 40 people in a beautifully renovated space. Exposed brick, pendant lighting, the kind of aesthetic that costs real money. My daughter-in-law was in almost every photo. My son was in several. There were catering trays visible in the background. A bartender. Florals that did not look inexpensive. I scrolled through the images 3 times. I was in none of them. I sent one text to my son that night. I'd like to see the studio this week. When works for you? He replied within a minute. Of course, Dad. Thursday evening? I said Thursday worked fine and set my phone face down on the counter. I did not sleep well that night. Not from anger, exactly. From the beginning of an understanding I was not ready to complete. Thursday came. The studio was genuinely beautiful. I will give her that. The space had been transformed with real care and real eye. Warm wood accents, which I suspected were a nod to me. Clean sightlines. A client seating area that felt expensive without screaming it. My son showed me around with the enthusiasm of someone who had made something real. I felt the warmth again, and for a moment, I let myself enjoy it. Then my daughter-in-law spread the budget reconciliation on the conference table. She called it that, budget reconciliation, the way an attorney calls a lie a misrepresentation. I looked at the numbers. The line items did not match page 4 of the business plan. The build-out had come in at $19,000, not $30,000. The equipment at $9,000, not $14,000. Marketing at $4,000, not $8,000. Operating reserve was listed at $6,000, not $11,000. The math was obvious. If the actuals were significantly lower than projected, there should have been money left over. There was not a single dollar listed as remaining balance. I asked where the remaining funds had gone. My daughter-in-law looked at me with the patience of someone explaining a traffic law to a tourist. We reallocated, Martin. Business is fluid. We put the savings toward other startup needs that came up. My son nodded beside her. The business plan was a projection, Dad, not a contract. I looked at my son when she said that. He did not meet my eyes. I drove home with both hands on the wheel and the radio off. I had the feeling I always got when a repair on a piece of equipment was more serious than the surface suggested. The kind where you pull one thing apart and find another problem underneath and another beneath that. I went home. I opened a spreadsheet. I started going back further than 6 weeks. 3 years of supporting my son's life in Portland. I had not added it up before because I never thought of it as accumulation. I thought of it as fatherhood. When he moved back from Bend after a bad breakup, I had paid first and last month on his apartment, $4,000. When he needed a new car after his transmission failed, I co-signed his loan and had been making 60% of the payments for 18 months, $22,000 so far and counting. When he and my daughter-in-law got married 2 years ago, I paid for the rehearsal dinner and the honeymoon because she had a large family and her parents had paid for the ceremony itself, $12,000. Graduate portfolio materials, when he needed to reprint his whole body of work for a career pivot, $1,800. Medical expense gap, when he changed jobs and had a coverage lapse, $3,200. I added the column twice. Before the studio investment, I had quietly put $124,000 into my son's adult life. Not loans. I had never asked to be repaid. I had never tracked it. I had never told him the total, because I did not want him to feel the weight of it. I wanted him to feel supported. I sat back from my desk and looked at the ceiling. Then I added the studio money, $209,000. And that was only what I could reconstruct from records I happened to keep. I was 62 years old. I had built a business worth something. My retirement accounts were healthy. My house was paid off, but I was not wealthy in the way people assumed when they saw my shop's reputation. I was comfortable because I had been careful for 4 decades. $209,000 was not nothing. I picked up the phone and called my attorney. Susan Mercer had handled my business contracts and commercial lease renewals for 11 years. She was precise and unhurried in a way that I had always found steadying. I told her I needed to talk about asset protection and estate planning, possibly some trust work, and that I would rather do it sooner than later. She had an opening the following Tuesday. In the meantime, I called a forensic accountant I had used twice before for business disputes. Ray Kowalski, 50s, methodical, the kind of man who could find a misallocated $400 transaction in a stack of 3 years' worth of statements. I told him I needed an analysis of how $85,000 had actually been spent, and that I had the business plan projection to compare against actuals. He said he would need bank records from the business account if one existed, which I would have to obtain through my son's cooperation or through other means. I said I would work on that. I called my son that evening. I told him I was putting together my own financial records for tax purposes, and that I needed to see the studio's account statements for the past 2 months. Routine, I said. He hesitated. I could hear her in the background, that particular quality of silence that was not silence at all. I'll have to get those together, Dad. Give me a few days. 3 days later, he sent me a PDF. It was 7 pages. I forwarded it to Ray that same evening. Ray called me on a Wednesday afternoon while I was trimming cabinet doors. I stepped outside to take the call. Martin, the actual build-out and equipment came in significantly under budget. That's documented. He paused. The differential, the money unaccounted for by business expenses, it's significant. About $41,000. I can account for roughly $43,000 in legitimate studio costs. The remaining $42,000 went somewhere else, but not to the business. I asked if he could tell me where. Not from these statements alone. The transfers out go to a personal account that isn't yours, and isn't your son's studio account. There's a third account receiving funds. He gave me the partial account number visible in the transfer records. I'd need more documentation to trace it further, but this is enough to establish that the funds were diverted from their stated purpose. I thanked him and went back inside to finish the cabinet doors. My hands were steady. I focused on the work. That evening I drove to the county assessor's website and searched property records. My daughter-in-law's name appeared on a deed filed 4 months ago. A condo in the South Park blocks, purchased for $312,000. Not a joint deed with my son. Her name alone. I sat with that information for a long time. Then I opened my legal pad and wrote action items at the top of a fresh page. Susan's office was in a converted Victorian on SW Broadway, the kind of building that had survived 100 years of Portland's reinvention. She listened without interrupting while I laid it out. The business plan, the diversion, Ray's findings, the property record, my son's apartment payments, car payments, the whole reconstructed history of financial support. When I finished, she tapped her pen once against her legal pad. Oregon gives you strong testamentary freedom, Martin. Adult children have no legal entitlement to inheritance. Your son's wife has zero claim on your estate. If she received funds through your son that were originally given for a stated business purpose, there may even be grounds for a fraud claim, but that's a separate conversation. She looked at me over her glasses. What do you want to accomplish? I told her I wanted 3 things. First, to protect everything I had built from any future claim. Second, to change my estate plan entirely. Third, to make sure that if I died tomorrow, my shop continued doing what it had always done, rather than becoming a bargaining chip. She nodded slowly. Have you thought about a charitable trust, or a structure that transfers the business to a specific individual or foundation? I'd been thinking about Derek. Derek Paulson had worked at my shop for 16 years. He had started sweeping floors at 22 and was now my most skilled craftsman and de facto floor manager. He knew every machine, every client, every vendor relationship I had built. He had a wife and 2 kids in East Portland, drove a truck with 200,000 miles on it, and had never once asked me for anything he had not earned. If I sold the shop tomorrow, Derek would lose his livelihood. If I died and left the business to my son, Derek would lose it within a year. I told Susan about Derek. We can structure this several ways, she said. An employee ownership transfer, either a direct sale at below market value with favorable terms, or a trust that places the business in Derek's hands upon certain conditions. She made notes. What about the rest of your estate? Your house, retirement accounts, any other assets? I told her I was thinking about a scholarship fund. There was a trade school in Portland that trained young people in woodworking and millwork. Small operation, chronically underfunded. The kind of place that turned kids who were failing in traditional school into people who were excellent with their hands. A designated charitable remainder trust, she said. Your assets fund the school upon your death. Derek gets the business at a price he can actually afford. Your son receives nothing beyond what you choose to give him while you're alive. She paused. Which, going forward, you would give him nothing. I said that was correct. She set down her pen and looked at me the way people look at you when they want to ask if you're sure without asking directly. I said I was sure. I drove to my shop from her office and spent the afternoon teaching a new hire how to read wood grain before cutting. Normal work, the kind that asked nothing of me but my hands and attention. My phone buzzed twice that afternoon, both times my son's name. I let it go to voicemail both times. The voicemails said the same thing with slight variations. Dad, I know you wanted those statements. I hope everything's okay. Call me when you get a chance. He did not yet know that Ray had already finished the analysis. He did not yet know about the property record. That evening, my daughter-in-law called from her own number. I watched it ring. A week passed. I met with Ray a second time, reviewed his written report, had him add 2 additional sections documenting the timeline of transfers in relation to the studio's stated build-out schedule. The report was 41 pages and it read like exactly what it was. A precise financial autopsy of a betrayal. I had 4 copies made and bound. 1 for me, 1 for Susan, 1 for a safe deposit box, 1 sealed in an envelope in my desk drawer at home. Then something shifted. The way it always does when one party in a dispute realizes the other has gone quiet. My daughter-in-law posted on her Instagram stories. I did not follow her, but a former client of mine did, and she forwarded it with a note that said she was not sure if I had seen it. The story was a photograph of my daughter-in-law sitting in the studio, face tilted down, the image carefully lit to look candid. The caption read, "Some people use money as a weapon. When you build something beautiful, and the person who helped fund it becomes your biggest source of pain, you start to understand what boundaries really mean. Grateful for this space, grieving the relationship that came with strings attached." Below that, a second story. A text graphic. A father who conditions love on financial control is not a father. He is a landlord. I read both twice. I thought about 41 years of working with my hands. I thought about the hospital room where Carol took her last breath, and I had held her hand and told her our boy would be all right. I would make sure of it. I thought about every payment I had made quietly so my son would never feel embarrassed about needing help. Then I opened a new folder on my computer and labeled it Documentation. I saved screenshots of both stories. The following Monday, I got a call from an old friend of mine named Gary, who had a construction business and ran in some of the same professional circles. He told me gently that my daughter-in-law had been making the rounds at a few networking events, mentioning that I had funded the studio and then tried to retract the gift when the business did not perform the way I wanted it to. I thanked Gary for telling me. I asked him what people seem to think. Honestly, most people who know you, Martin, they're waiting to hear your side. But she's personable, and she talks a good game. A few folks who don't know you well, they might believe it. I said I appreciated him calling. That evening I added a new section to my documentation folder. I titled it Narrative Campaign, Timeline of Events. I started logging every instance. The Instagram stories, Gary's call, a mention my shop's new hire, brought up awkwardly 2 days later about something she had seen on a neighborhood app. Each one dated and noted. I called Susan and told her what was happening. It's a predictable tactic, she said, without a trace of surprise. Control the story before the other party can present facts. Are you ready to move faster on the trust documents? I said I was. I also told her about the Portland Craftsman and Builders Expo, coming up in 3 weeks. My shop had been a sponsor for 9 years. It was the largest regional gathering of trades, professionals, architects, designers, and clients in the Pacific Northwest. 400 people, maybe more. My daughter-in-law's studio had applied for exhibitor space this year. I had seen the application list when the organizing committee sent it out to sponsors. Susan was quiet for a moment. "Are you thinking what I think you're thinking?" I said I was thinking that if a confrontation was coming, I would rather it happen on ground, I understood, with people who had known me for decades, than on social media where my daughter-in-law had already started writing the script. "Then let's make sure you're ready," Susan said. "Not just legally, completely ready." The next 2 weeks were methodical. I met with Derek on a Tuesday evening after everyone else had gone home. We sat in my office with the door closed and 2 cups of coffee going cold between us. I told him what I was planning: the business transfer, the terms, the timeline. I watched his face go through several things in rapid succession. Confusion, then something close to grief, then a very careful stillness. "Martin, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything tonight. Think about it. Talk to your wife." I slid a folder across the desk. Susan drafted the preliminary terms. "The price is well below market. The payment structure gives you 10 years. The shop's reputation and client list transfer with it." He picked up the folder but did not open it. "Is everything okay with your family?" "It will be," I said. He called me 2 days later to say yes. I signed the trust documents on a Thursday morning at Susan's office. My house, my personal savings, my retirement accounts, all of it designated to the Portland School of Woodworking and Applied Trades upon my death. The business transfer to Derek would begin on a formal payment schedule the following month. My son was named nowhere in the document. My daughter-in-law was named nowhere in the document. Susan applied her notary seal and slid the copies across the table. "Any chance of changing your mind?" She was not trying to talk me out of it. She was being thorough. "None," I said. "Then this is as solid as it gets." The expo was held at the Oregon Convention Center on a Friday evening in late October. I arrived at 6, wearing the charcoal blazer I kept for professional events. Webb Custom Millwork sponsor display was near the main entrance, as it had been for the past 4 years. I shook hands, talked shop with contractors and architects I had known since the 90s, had a glass of club soda, and listened to a panel discussion about supply chain changes in hardwood lumber. I saw them arrive at 7:15, my son in a sport coat that was slightly too large, my daughter-in-law in a dark dress with the kind of quiet elegance that takes effort and money to project. They had a table near the back. "Form and grain," the sign read, with a portfolio book open and some printed materials fanned out. She worked the room efficiently, moving from conversation to conversation, her body language purposeful. I did not approach them. I stayed where I was and let the evening proceed. Around 8:30, during the intermission between the panel discussion and the award presentations, the room's energy shifted. I saw my daughter-in-law moving toward the front. My son followed 2 steps behind. She exchanged a word with one of the event staff near the podium and was handed the wireless microphone. The room settled into attention the way rooms do when someone takes a microphone uninvited but with confidence. "Thank you. I'm so sorry to interrupt." Her voice carried the kind of practiced warmth that a good communicator develops. "I know this isn't the time or place, but I'm standing here next to my husband, and across this room I can see his father, and I think it's important to say something." She paused, looked toward where I was standing. "Martin, we know we made mistakes. We know communication broke down. But you're Ethan's father, and we love you. And if there's any chance we can find a path back to each other, we're asking for it publicly because private conversations haven't worked." She held the microphone toward my son, who added, voice thick, "Dad, please." 400 people looked at me. I recognized the construction. I had watched it being built for 2 weeks in real time, on social media, at networking events, in the quiet work of reframing a story before the other person could tell it. Refuse, and I was the cold, controlling father. Accept, and I validated a narrative built on $41,000 that had vanished, and a property my daughter-in-law purchased in her name alone. I walked toward the podium. The crowd shifted to let me through. My daughter-in-law extended the microphone with a smile that did not reach her eyes. I took it. I looked out at the room. Contractors, architects, Designers, shop owners, clients. People who had known me since I was running a one-man operation out of a borrowed garage. People who had seen Jade's Instagram stories and heard the version of events she had been distributing at events like this one. "Thank you for the opportunity," I said. "I want to tell you about Foreman Grain." Behind me, the presentation screen that had been showing Expo sponsor logos flickered. I had coordinated with the AV team 2 days prior. 18 months ago, my son came to me with a business plan for an interior design studio. I was proud of him. I believed in him. I wired $85,000 to his account the following week. I let that land. The business plan projected costs of $85,000. The actual costs came in around $43,000. A forensic accounting analysis I commissioned 2 weeks ago documents that the remaining $42,000 was transferred to a personal account. The screen behind me showed Ray's summary table. Categories, amounts, dates. That personal account is registered to my daughter-in-law. She had taken a step back. Her expression had not changed, but the quality of her stillness had. Additionally, a property record filed 4 months ago, 1 month before the studio opened, shows a condo in the South Park blocks purchased in my daughter-in-law's name alone. The purchase price was $312,000. The property record appeared on the screen. My son has no ownership stake in that property. My son was standing very still beside her now. He was not looking at me. He was looking at the floor. I understand my daughter-in-law's perspective. She built something real. The studio is genuinely beautiful. I will say that. I paused. But it was built with money I gave for a purpose, and $42,000 of it went somewhere the business plan never intended. I looked toward her directly. That is not a misunderstanding. That is not a communication breakdown. That is a choice. The room was absolutely still. Last Thursday morning, I signed an irrevocable trust. My estate, my house, my retirement savings will fund the Portland School of Woodworking and Applied Trades. My business will transfer to my shop manager, Derek Paulson, who has worked alongside me for 16 years and has never once taken anything he did not earn. I set the microphone on the podium. My son receives nothing, not because I stopped loving him, but because love is not a transaction, and I am done being the only party in this relationship who understood that. I straightened my jacket, looked out at the room one more time. I appreciate you listening. Enjoy the rest of the evening. The applause started in the back. It moved forward, and then it was everywhere. Not polite, not obligatory. Real applause. Several people were standing. I stepped away from the podium and walked toward the exit without looking at the table where my daughter-in-law had been standing. I heard a chair scrape. I heard my son say her name, low and urgent. I heard the ambient noise of the room resume around whatever was happening at that table, and I walked through it without turning around. Gary caught up with me near the coat check. "Martin." He gripped my shoulder. "I owe you an apology. I should have been louder 2 weeks ago about what she was saying around town." "You told me," I said. "That was enough. There's 2 sides to every story. I just didn't realize how far apart the 2 sides were." I drove home through a Friday night Portland that looked like it always did. Rain on the Willamette. The bridges lit. The city doing what cities do. I sat in my truck in my driveway for a few minutes before going inside. Not to collect myself. I was already collected. I just wanted to sit with the stillness for a moment before it was replaced by whatever came next. Inside, Copper lifted his head from the rug, wagged once, lowered it again. My phone had 17 messages. I set it on the counter without reading any of them. I made myself a sandwich and ate it at the kitchen table. Then, I went to my desk and looked at the trust documents one more time. My house, my savings, the school that would turn young people's hands into futures. Derek's name on a payment plan. Real things. Things I could account for. I went to bed at 10 and slept without difficulty. The next morning arrived gray and quiet. Saturday, I made coffee, took it to the back porch, watched the fir trees drip. Copper leaned against my leg. My phone showed 29 missed calls and a thread of messages from my son that I scrolled through without reading in full. The word sorry appeared many times. So did the word please. My daughter-in-law had not called or texted at all. I spent the morning in my shop. resetting my bench after a week of administrative distraction. Cleaned the router table, sharpened 2 chisels, organized the finish cabinet the way I liked it. Derek came in around 11, even though it was Saturday, which was not unusual for him. He worked quietly for a while before speaking. "People are talking about last night," he said. "I imagine so. Most of what I'm hearing is the way you handled yourself." He ran a hand along a board he was jointing. "Not what you said, how you said it." I did not respond to that. "Martin." He stopped working. "I've been here 16 years. I know what this shop means to you. I know what it cost you to build it, and what it cost you to keep it going when things were hard." He looked at the floor. "I'm not going to let you down." "I know that," I said. "That's why I chose you." We worked until 2 in the afternoon without talking much, which was how we usually worked, and it felt normal in a way that nothing had felt normal in a month. My son arrived at 4 that afternoon. He was alone. He sat in his car in my driveway for 15 minutes before getting out. I watched from the kitchen window. He walked to the front door with his shoulders forward, his hands in his jacket pockets, the posture of someone who was not sure what would happen when the door opened. I opened it before he knocked. He looked older than he had 2 weeks ago. Not in the way of illness, but in the way of something having settled on him that would not lift quickly. "Dad." I did not step back to invite him in. I stood in the doorway. "I know I don't have the right to ask anything from you," he said. His voice was steadier than I expected. "I'm not here to ask. I just needed to say something to your face." I waited. I knew about the transfer. He said it with his eyes on mine, which I gave him credit for. Not the full amount. She told me it was a personal financial reserve. Emergency money. I told myself that was reasonable. He stopped. Swallowed. I told myself that a lot of things were reasonable because it was easier than asking questions that had uncomfortable answers. I listened. The condo I didn't know about until 2 days ago. His jaw tightened. "I want you to know that. I don't know if it matters to you, but I want you to know." "It matters," I said, "but it doesn't change anything." He nodded. He had expected that. "I understand," he said. "I'm sorry, Dad. I know that doesn't cover it. I'm just sorry." I looked at my son for a long moment. The same tall build as his mother, the same way of going quiet when he was being honest, a quality she had that I had always loved. He was 31 years old, and he had made serious choices and let someone use him as a conduit for something I could not forgive. He had also come to my door alone and told me the truth without anyone requiring him to. "You need to figure out your own situation," I said. "Not this one. Yours. What you're going to do about a marriage that used you to take from someone who loved you." His throat moved. "That's a question only you can answer," I said. "But it's the one that actually matters now." He stood on my porch for another moment. Then he said, "I know." He stepped back, turned, walked to his car. He did not look back, which was the right call. Some goodbyes are not improved by prolonging them. I closed the door, locked it, went back to the kitchen, and finished the glass of water I had left on the counter. Through the window, I watched his car back out and turn down the street. His brake lights disappeared at the corner. My phone rang. Susan's name. "I heard from Morrison and Associates," she said. "Your daughter-in-law retained them Friday afternoon, right after the expo. They called me this morning." "What are they claiming?" "Breach of oral contract. Promissory estoppel. Claiming you made representations about ongoing financial support for the business, and that she relied on those representations to her detriment." Susan's tone was even, almost dry. "They're also floating the phrase unjust enrichment, which, given what Ray's report documents, is a fairly remarkable claim. Can they do anything? Legally? No. Oregon law is clear. You can pursue a claim against her for the diverted funds if you choose. She cannot successfully claim entitlement to your estate or future support." A pause. "I'll send a response letter this week. Polite, firm, documented. It'll be the last thing they file before realizing they have nothing." I thanked her and set the phone on the counter again. That evening I drove out to the Portland School of Woodworking and Applied Trades on SE Division, the one I had designated in the trust. It was a converted warehouse, corrugated metal exterior, warm light coming through the high windows, A Saturday evening class was running, visible through the glass. Young people bent over benches with hand planes and marking gauges. One of them could not have been older than 17. Another looked closer to 30, the kind of age where a person had already tried something else and found their way here. I sat in the parking lot for a while and watched the light in those windows. 38 years ago, I had learned my trade in a shop, not unlike this one. A patient man named Victor had shown me how to read grain, how to sharpen a blade so that the shaving it produced was thinner than paper, how to take the time that work required rather than the time you wanted to give it. Victor died in 2003, and I had gone to his funeral and stood at the back of the church, feeling that I owed him something I had never properly expressed. This was how I would pay it. I pulled out of the lot and drove home through the Saturday evening city, past the Saturday evening people with their Saturday evening lives, the restaurants and the dog walkers, and the couples on the streetcar, and the old man on the corner, waiting for the light. Portland in October, gray and rain-polished, and indifferent to any individual person's particular reckoning. I made dinner. I sat at the table where my wife and I had eaten thousands of meals, where my son had done his homework and spilled orange juice, and grown from a boy who needed everything into a man who had made some very serious mistakes, and had, at the end of it, come to my door alone and told me the truth. I thought about what came next. Susan had mentioned a fifth possibility, something she called a prodigal clause in wills, a provision that allowed reinstatement of a beneficiary if specific conditions were met over a specific period of time. Real conditions, not apologies and promises. Actions over time. Accountability measured in years. I had not asked her to add it, not yet. But I thought about it at that kitchen table, and I thought about my son driving away in the dark, and I thought about the 17-year-old at the woodworking bench, bending over a hand plane with the specific concentration of someone discovering what their hands could do. I left the question open. That is the right thing to do with questions that do not require an immediate answer. I washed my plate and glass and dried them and put them away. I let Copper out one last time and stood on the back porch while he made his rounds of the yard, sniffing the fence line the way he always did, the same route every night like he was maintaining a territory that had never once changed. The rain had stopped. The air smelled like wet fur and pavement. Somewhere down the block, someone was burning applewood in a fireplace, the sweetest smoke there is. I had 38 years of work behind me that was going to continue doing something meaningful after I was gone. I had a man I trusted absolutely now running the shop I had built. I had documents drawn up properly, and filed and witnessed, and impossible to undo without cause that did not exist. I had made decisions based on facts rather than anger, on clarity rather than grief, on the kind of cold-eyed accounting that 38 years with my hands in the work had taught me was the only way to solve anything correctly. I called Copper in from the yard. He came without needing to be called twice. That dog had never once taken advantage of my trust. I scratched behind his ears for a long time in the quiet kitchen. Then I turned off the lights and went to bed. Tomorrow I would go back to the shop. There was a kitchen cabinet project for a new restaurant on NW 23rd that needed my attention. A set of custom built-ins for a house in Lake Oswego, a young hire who was still learning how to move around a table saw without thinking about it. Real work. Work that made something a person could stand in front of and know exactly what it had cost to build. I closed my eyes. The house settled into its nighttime sounds. No dread in the corners. No weight of obligation owed to someone who had never understood what obligation meant. Just a house. Just a man. Just the rest of a life that still had a great deal of work left in it. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Hit like if you think Martin made the right call. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. We'll see you there.